Hello and welcome to the MongoDB podcast. As ever, I'm Shane McAllister, and today we've got a fascinating discussion lined up where we're tackling the crucial topic of data orchestration, along with the deep dive into the newly introduced Airflow 3.0. But before that, and a somewhat public service announcement, apparently it's World Streaming Day. Did you know that? I didn't, but my producer Jesse Hall did, and he told me to remind everybody. So if you're not already streaming everything, then show some love to your favorite streaming service and stream some more, as you are doing on this live stream from MongoDB. Anyway, after all that excitement on World Streaming Day, some housekeeping. If you're new to our podcast live streams, it's great to have you visit the MongoDB YouTube channel to check out some past episodes. And if you're a returning viewer, you're very, very welcome back. And thanks for joining once again. We do appreciate it. So whilst we get ready for today's stream, do drop a shout out in the chat on YouTube or LinkedIn to tell us who you are and where you're tuning in from. We really love to hear from our fantastic viewers. And once the show kicks off, use the same chat on YouTube and LinkedIn to pop any burning questions that you might have for my guest. And we'll tackle them live, or we'll hopefully have some time at the end to wrap them up as well too. And we really appreciate the interactivity there. As ever, the live stream is being recorded, so we'll be on MongoDB's YouTube channel and LinkedIn post-show as well too. So don't worry if you missed the beginning or you can't stay for the whole show. The recording will be there for you to catch up with at your leisure. So with that, on with the show. Today is entitled The Future of Data Orchestration, and my guest is Kenten Danas, a Senior Manager of Developer Relations at Astronomer. So Kenten, you're very welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, Shane. It's great to be here. I'm good. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. It's great to have you. Where in the world are you, Kenten? I'm asking the viewers to tell us where they are and where they're joining from. Where are you?
Yeah, I'm in Seattle, Washington.
Excellent.
On the west coast of the U.S.
Okay, so I'm getting you early then, basically.
Yeah, just getting the day started over here.
Excellent. Well, look, it's great to have you on board. I always try to dive a little bit into our guest's background and I suppose your journey to date, what you studied, maybe how you ended up in Astronomer. So where did you begin? Where did all this begin for you, Kenten?
Yeah, that's a great question. I started doing my master's in data science and so studied that, and then kind of immediately right after that ended up sort of accidentally falling into data engineering. So I worked in consulting after my master's and found that a lot of the projects where they would add data scientists, often the work was actually more data engineering, pretty typical, just in terms of not a lot of modeling can go on until you actually have all of the data in place. And I found that I really liked that data engineering work. And that's what led me to use Airflow. This was way back in 2019 when Airflow was still a little bit more in the earlier days. We'll talk a lot about Airflow more on the podcast. So, but yeah, that's what ended up leading me to Astronomer. I started at Astronomer back in 2020 on our field engineering team, so helping our prospective customers adopt our products. And then we were still a smaller startup at that time. And then as we grew, ended up doing kind of more and more developer relations work. I found I really liked the teaching and educational aspect of working with data engineers and data scientists on how to adopt tools. And yeah, have been leading and growing out our DevRel program for the last couple of years.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have a fellow DevReller on the show as well, too. And we've turned the tables a little bit on you this time as well, too, Kenten, because you host your own podcast, the Data Flowcast. Tell us a little bit about that.
I do, yeah. So I love hosting our podcast. As you said, the Data Flowcast is focused on how companies use Airflow. So we talk to a lot of data engineers, ML engineers, folks like that on how they've implemented Airflow at their companies and what sort of use cases it solves for them. I really love getting to hear about all of the different implementations and how people are using different technologies to solve their problems. So yeah, I think hosting a podcast is really fun. It's an interesting turn to be a guest on one.
I'll take it easy on you anyway. So Kenten, just knowing that someday maybe you might return the favor and we get to jump on your one, right? So
Absolutely. We would love that.
got to be careful for that. So look, in the introduction, I talked about data orchestration, Kenten. For those, and we've got a wide, varied audience, obviously, here on our podcast. Could you talk a little bit about what is orchestration from a data perspective?
Yeah. So most broadly, I think about orchestration as the process of creating and automating workflows that are used to create data products. And by data products, we mean whatever the end product is that you're using that is either powered by data or maybe is the data itself. So that could be something like a dashboard that you use for analytics. It could be, a front end website that your customers are interacting with that has some sort of AI personalization behind it. Whatever that might be, the data is usually core to that. And the orchestration is everything you have to do to get the data from the raw state where it's coming in to the end state where it's actually powering those products.
Okay. And obviously, whose main concern is that in the kind of day-to-day building? With regards to kind of that orchestration, who's the person most concerned about orchestration in any company building any application?
Yeah, I think it really varies and is it kind of everybody. I mean, there's often a lot of stakeholders involved because data is so critical to most companies' work. Again, either internally or externally or both. So I think in terms of managing the orchestration itself, oftentimes those are data teams. So a lot of data engineers, data scientists, there's a million titles that fall into that, but the folks who are responsible for managing that data. It's typically the technical folks on the engineering side, but again, the stakeholders really vary all the way up to, executives who are consuming the end data.
Okay, that's very clear. So shout out to all the viewers, Chetan from India and Samuel from Nigeria and Ayush from Dublin, which is just up the road from me. I'm in Limerick in Ireland as well too. And Greg in Dallas and Dennis also in Dublin. So yeah, good Irish contingent so far. So we talked about orchestration and we're going to talk about Airflow and we're going to talk about Astronomer. But for those, again, tell us all about Apache Airflow in a nutshell, Kenten. What does that do? How does that help developers in their day-to-day?
Yeah, so Airflow is an orchestration tool. It's an open source project. About it as it's a tool used for authoring, running, and monitoring data pipelines. So a lot of what goes into orchestration. Airflow was originally created out of Airbnb and then was open source back
Hence the name, I suppose, right?
Yes. I think that's probably somewhere where it came in. I don't have a good story there on the naming. But yeah, it was pretty quickly open sourced. And then back in, I want to say 2019 was picked up as a top level Apache Software Foundation project.
Brilliant. Okay. And I suppose we talked about orchestration, but Airflow, and I would imagine there's other solutions out there as well too for orchestration. But what kind of core problem did Airflow bring to the ecosystem, as it were, that others didn't at that time?
Yeah, there's lots of tools in the orchestration space. And I guess I'll start answering that question by taking kind of the broad lens of just the challenges with orchestration in general, because I think to a lot of folks, and maybe as I've described it, it sounds very simple, automating a workflow. I think lots of people might be familiar with using something like cron, like scheduling a script to run is pretty easy, right? Anybody can do that. But there are you quickly get into kind of a lot of complication with that when you're dealing with a large amount of data or complex use cases. Like what happens if, something fails? Like, what do you do? Do you retry a task? Do you run downstream tasks? How do you manage that logic? How do you connect to external systems? We'll talk more about that. But with orchestration, you're rarely dealing with everything, just within your on-prem system. You're probably using other tools, databases like MongoDB, for example. So how do you manage the authentication to that? How do you manage dependencies between your different pipelines? All of those things are questions that an orchestration tool should solve. And how do you view all of the progress and manage that? So how do you know what's going on? What failed, what succeeded, how long did something take, what resources is it using? So again, I could go on and on about this, like lots of questions to answer. So that's generally what an orchestration tool is going to provide, is that additional functionality that helps you manage all of that. Okay. And one of the things that Airflow brought that in the early days of the Airflow project was a really new concept, was this idea of your pipelines being written as code. So everything in Airflow is written in Python. We will often say, like on my team, if you can write a function in Python, then you can run it with Airflow. And that brings a couple of benefits over oftentimes before tools like Airflow, and there are others, orchestration tools that are now code-based. Before that, you would be using something that was more like a drag and drop. We refer to them as kind of legacy schedulers, where you would have some sort of GUI where you've got, icons that represent certain functionality, and you build a pipeline that way. Part of why pipelines as code sort of took off, and is one of the reasons for Airflow's original popularity, is one, it makes things a lot more flexible. So again, if you can write a function in Python, then you can run it in Airflow. It also allows you to treat your pipelines just like you would any other piece of software. So you can use, all of the software development best practices that you would expect for something that is really providing the infrastructure for, again, a critical part of your business. You want to use those best practices so you can integrate version control, you can manage how your teams are developing on that code, things like that.
Okay, so they're kind of the use cases where, or the examples where Airflow really shines, then stands out from maybe the others as well too. And I suppose from as an example of a heavy user who would require, a company that would require a heavy use of orchestration and Airflow and everything else, what would the typical verticals or industries that typically are customers who do require heavy orchestration of their data?
Yeah, I mean, it really varies. And so Airflow is a massively popular project. We frequently see it have more than like 30 million downloads a month. It's used by countries.
I didn't know it was that huge.
Wow. Yeah, it is truly massive, and has grown a ton in the last like 4 or 5 years. And I think part of the reason for that is there's not really one industry I could point to that to answer that question. It's sort of everything. I mean, we see Airflow used by, the biggest banks in the world. We see it used by huge healthcare companies. We see it used by huge retail organizations. Like pretty much every company has to manage data and orchestrate it, and Airflow is just one of the most popular choices. And so, it's hugely popular.
Okay, so with that kind of massive popularity of Airflow, where does Astronomer come in then? So Kenten, where does that fit in the puzzle then? So
So Astronomer is one of the biggest maintainers of the open source Airflow project. So we contribute a lot to the open source project. We manage all of the releases. We drive a lot of the new features in the project. So we're heavily invested in Airflow itself. We also, as a company, created Astro, which is our unified data ops platform. I can talk more about what that means, but a piece of that is a managed Airflow service. So that is the product that we sell to our customers.
Okay, that makes sense then. So, and in much the same way as, MongoDB's origins were open source, and, essentially Atlas is our database as a service in the cloud, which is, how we monetize MongoDB. Other than that, the open source version is available for the community for download and to use. So it makes it's a tried and proven pathway for companies. And I think it's really good that you're kind of the main contributors back to Airflow as well too, because I think that's, from a community perspective, it's really important to be contributing back and, showing, I suppose, maybe the pathway, showing maybe the roadmap as to what you would like to add features there, but still back to Airflow and the open source. I I suppose keeping on the level of Astronomer, and obviously we're going to do a demo in a while, and for our audience and viewers, do stay tuned for that as well too. So beyond the platform itself, what else does, you mentioned Astro, what else does Astronomer have, or what else does Astronomer do for the Airflow community?
Yeah. So in terms of our product, we think about, unified data ops platform, and we refer to it that way because for, creating the data products that I've mentioned, these, end products that companies they're selling or relying on internally that are based on the data that they have. Orchestration is a big piece of that, or we think of it as kind of the bottom layer, where you have to be able to take the data from where it's coming in its raw state and get it into the right place in the right form. It's not the only layer that is important. So that's the piece where Airflow really solves the problem. Again, having a managed Airflow service just means you don't have to deal with running Airflow. You can just focus on the data itself. We have also added other functionality to that platform to kind of build up that data ops picture. So observability is one where we're pretty heavily focused right now. We have Astro Observe, which is our observability platform within the product that provides more functionality, again, on top of Airflow for just everything you would need to do to observe lots of different data pipelines. So whether that's managing SLAs, having, anomaly detection, how do you figure out what's going on and kind of proactively intervene before you've got a big problem in your end product. So that's one area that answers your question, I think, from kind of a product perspective. I can also talk about other things that we do just for the Airflow community beyond our products as well.
Yeah, because you have the Astronomer Registry and the Academy, etc., as well too. So tell me a little bit about both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion for the work that my team does at Astronomer with developer relations. So like one of the big goals is we really want using Airflow to be a good experience for everybody that is. And again, we know it's used kind of massively all over the world. One of the great things about Airflow, I think, is that it's super flexible. You can do almost anything with it. We see it used for this huge variety of use cases. There's a ton of different functionality in terms of features and other tools you can integrate with. The downside to that is that you can do anything with it. And it means that, it can be kind of hard to learn all of those different things. It can also be hard to know what you should do in terms of implementing best practices and things like that. So we develop a lot of resources to try and help Airflow users just get it right in terms of how can you make the most out of this tool without like shooting yourself in the foot. So we've got resources in a variety of different forms. So you mentioned our Academy, which is a great one. That is where we have video courses on how to do different things with Airflow, including like how to get started for new users, how to write pipelines using best practices and making use of different features. And then along with that, certifications that you can take, which is a great thing to, kind of test your knowledge and also to put on your resume. So that's one thing. The registry is another that is kind of additional information about how to use all of the integrations that Airflow has. So I've talked about, have literally never seen somebody who used Airflow who didn't have to connect with another tool. That's just not how data orchestration works. So they're always going to be working with like a MongoDB or, something, probably a variety of other tools. And Airflow has all of these packages that enable you to do that. But again, knowing how to use them, what is in them, can be quite challenging. So the registry is just meant to be a kind of a one-stop shop for you to go and see how do all of these other packages work? How do I implement them?
Okay.
What are some examples for doing so?
Okay, so the registry is like the ecosystem of things that you can plug in with Airflow, right?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And thanks to the folks who are posting questions already. Shamnad, hopefully we will get to that. Certainly. Sad, this is not the live stream to talk about the differences between MongoDB and other databases. I'm sure if you search on the website, you will find all of that. And there are some shows that we have on our YouTube that cover that as well too. So Airflow 3, as I mentioned in our introduction, Kenten, that was a significant release. Talk to me a little bit about kind of, the primary goals and the motivations for this and what's new in Airflow 3. There's probably lots, and I know we're going to go through it in a bit as well too. But at a high level, what are the new features there for users and the most exciting things for users of Airflow?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe I'll start with just a little bit of history. So I mentioned the Airflow project is about 10 years old now, and has been, a top level ASF project for the last, I don't know, since 2018, 2019. Airflow 2, which was the previous major release, came out in 2020. And that brought, a lot of Airflow was getting pretty popular around that time. And Airflow 2 brought some pretty big architectural changes that made the project a lot more stable. So that, these large enterprise companies who wanted to use it for, again, kind of really critical data orchestration for data that powers their core products could rely on it without having, a lot of manual constant intervention. So that was great. And then in the intermediate years between, 2020 and now, there have been lots of minor releases that have brought tons of new features. So like the Airflow project is always changing, and there's always lots of stuff being added to it. It's a really, really active project with lots of developers contributing. Airflow 3, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, was easily the first major release in about 4.5 years or so. And there were a couple of things that prompted kind of wanting to have a major release for the project now. And the biggest thing is that between 2020 and now, we've seen this big shift between, users primarily working with Airflow for kind of traditional ETL, BI analytics sort of use cases. So ETL to manage like internal dashboards for doing company analytics, which is still extremely common and very popular, and Airflow is great for it. But in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge shift towards people also using Airflow for managing MLOps workflows, for managing Gen AI workflows. For doing a lot more, complex and a bigger variety of use cases. And that kind of prompted, some new features within Airflow to support those new use cases that required both breaking changes. So hence the, Airflow's semantic version. So breaking change means we have to do a new major version. And also just a time to kind of recircle and take in a lot of community feedback that we've been getting over the past couple of years. And when I say we, I mean, not just Astronomer, but like the whole Airflow community, right, takes very seriously what the Airflow community is saying they want. So figuring out, okay, what features are we going to build that support these new use cases and will allow it to be adopted even more than it is now. So there are kind of, I think about Airflow 3 as the features falling into three kind of big themes. One is sort of ease of use. So we'll talk a little more, I think, about some of these features, but DAG versioning was an example. And by DAG, I mean data pipeline in Airflow. If people aren't familiar, they're called DAGs. So versioning of those within product was probably the number one community requested feature.
Okay. And I saw in some of the notes at the time, as you said, it was only a couple of weeks ago, some React-based UI, some API improvements, a whole host of things. I suppose, do you have an understanding, or do you know, like, obviously with Airflow being open source, how many PRs were involved in pulling all of this together? How many people? Or, is that just kind of too big to number?
I think so. That's actually a good question. I don't know off the top of my head the number of PRs that went into Airflow 3. It was a lot. I mean, I think there were like in one of the weeks, just the weeks leading up to Airflow 3, there were like over 100 PRs that were getting merged. The Airflow project in general has over 3,000 contributors now. And I think the Airflow 3 release had more people involved contributing than any other release in the past in the project. So that number has continued to grow as well. So It's a really exciting time. And part of the reason there are so many features in the new release is there are a lot of people who are really excited about adding additional functionality to the project and are doing so.
Okay. What's your favorite new feature? If you could pick one, Kenton, what would you lead with? What do you point out if somebody says, hey, show me the cool new thing?
Yeah, I think so. I've already mentioned a little bit DAG versioning, which I always bring up again because it was the number one community requested feature and something
Okay.
people have been talking about for a long time. So I personally always love it when, again, just the community aspect of it comes into a release and there's
Mhm.
that feedback is taken and developed. And I know that was a feature that was developed by folks at Astronomer, and just a lot of like love and hard work was put into getting that out there. So
Mhm.
that is really exciting. I think there are also some features we can talk about that were designed specifically to support kind of the new use cases that we see Airflow being used for. So like LLM ops or kind of Gen
Mhm.
AI use cases, or ML ops. Um, a couple of things there, some of which were, breaking changes and big things kind of on the architectural side. So not that
Mhm.
users would necessarily see, but changes to how Airflow works and executes tasks that make it more secure, and then also open the door for different options for scheduling pipelines, and running tasks in different ways.
Okay. And for those that might already be using Astronomer 2.0, right? And you mentioned, there's some breaking changes there. In order to move and migrate to 3.0, what sort of considerations should they give when planning to maybe do that, Kenton? Are there any migration tools for things that they might have there? Or is there any, step-by-step basis to run through that? If folks listening to this are already using Airflow 2.0 and they're going, wow, I want to move, what should they be most kind of thinking of when planning that move?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say, especially for companies who are running Airflow in production, upgrading can be challenging. And it's
Mhm.
especially
Mhm.
challenging for a major release, right? Where there are
Sure.
breaking changes. But I will say, yes, there are things you can use to help. So there are a couple of utilities available as part of the open source project. And Astronomer has a guide on how to use some of these. I think there's also documentation in the open source project. But one of them is some rough rules that you can run against your code base that will help tell you what in your pipeline code needs to change,
Mhm. Mhm.
because there are things that have moved around. So imports might change. Some features have changed a little bit in terms of how you use them, things like that. There's also a linter for your Airflow config, which is more, again, how you define your configuration for how Airflow is going to run under the hood. So a lot of stuff there has changed, either parameters that have been removed, added,
Okay.
moved to a different location, things like that. It will help you identify those things. The other thing I'll add there is for people who are running Airflow using Astro, so using a managed service, we
Mhm.
have an additional, guide for our customers on how to use these tools in the context of running Airflow on Astro. We also, one of the great things about using a managed service like Astro is it makes it a lot easier to just spin up a new Airflow instance so you can try it out. You can move things over, and you can do that, without kind of all of the extra work of like
Okay.
managing the new infrastructure and things like that.
Okay, excellent. So I know we're going to get to the demo shortly. I wanted to, you touched on it a couple of times, AI and machine learning. Obviously, if Airflow 2 was 4 years ago, somewhere in the middle of these 4 years, this Gen AI revolution happened. Some will put it at the date of November 22, et cetera, as well, or 23, sorry. And, so how has that, Gen AI, machine learning, et cetera, impacted on Airflow 3 in any particular ways?
Yeah, it absolutely has. And I think it was, again, one of the things that prompted a major version now and some of the changes that came that were
Mm,
breaking changes, again, to support
okay.
these new use cases. So, one of the big changes in Airflow 3 is what we call task isolation. So this is an architectural change that happened under the hood and changed the way in which Airflow workers that run the tasks in your pipelines interact with Airflow's database that powers all
Okay.
of the metadata.
We've done something very similar in MongoDB to
Okay.
handle, our search workloads are separated now to be able
Yeah.
to handle the search heavy workloads that AI apps have.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think there's, the security aspect of that change so that workers can no longer directly access the metadata database. This is just good for, again, a good practice that reduces a one vector of security risk. It also opened the door for what we refer to as remote execution. So generally when you run Airflow, you have your Airflow infrastructure itself. So there's a couple of core components just used to run Airflow. And then you have some concept of workers. So the processes that are actually running the tasks in your pipeline. So depending on how you configure that, that might be like standing workers using something like Celery. It might be like Kubernetes pods if you're using Kubernetes. Again, you have multiple options on how you set that up. But generally, it was all previously running within your Airflow infrastructure. So you would deploy Airflow somewhere, either like using Astros or a managed service or doing it yourself, maybe on a Kubernetes cluster in the cloud. And that's where all of your tasks ran. That's a little limiting, both if you have sort of larger workloads that you need to manage using more specialized infrastructure like a GPU or something like that. Also for a lot of industry verticals that are working with really sensitive data that maybe can't have their data within wherever their Airflow is running. So we see that a lot in like financial services and healthcare, places like that. So now in Airflow 3 with remote execution, you can actually have your workers somewhere entirely different from Airflow, including on-prem if you need to run them there. And then they can still just communicate the key status of your task back to your Airflow instance. So this was one of the biggest, again, architectural changes in Airflow 3. And AI workflows are certainly not the only ones impacted by that. I think it's relevant for a lot of other use cases, but we do see that being very relevant there.
And is that, and maybe I'm incorrect in this, is that kind of setting it up to handle this agentic world that we seem to be moving towards and a lot of things as well to be able to manage that remote worker style thing inside of Airflow?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great use case for this. And we have, at Astronomer, we're developing other open source, tools that you would use with Airflow to help you manage agentic style workflows. So yeah, that's absolutely relevant.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, look, we've covered an awful lot. I think it's a bit of time for maybe some show and tell to ground all of this in terms of a demo and an example, Kenten. So what are we going to see today in the demo that you have?
Yeah, so the demo I have today is running on Airflow 3, so we can touch on the Airflow 3 features, which I think is helpful. But it's also a great example of how Airflow can be used to interact with other tools. So we have a pipeline that is using MongoDB. In this case, we do actually have a Gen AI pipeline. So we're managing a pipeline that will give you video game recommendations based on some input. So we're using OpenAI to manage the vector embeddings, adding embeddings back from data that we submit. And then all of that is, again, stored in Atlas using the vector database.
Okay, excellent. I look forward to seeing that. And I suppose as we get ready for that, if anyone has questions with regard to the demo or anything that Kenten has been talking about up until now, please drop them in the comments and we'll try and manage them as we're on air as well too. But yeah, let's see some of this in action, Kenten. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, let's get into it. Let me share my screen here. All right, we should be looking at the Airflow UI.
There you go. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we did touch a little bit earlier on the Airflow UI got a huge refresh in Airflow 3. So if anybody listening was familiar with Airflow and has used it before, but it's still on Airflow 2, this will look a lot different. It is fully redesigned and using kind of more modern tech on the back end, but also it's just a lot more straightforward, gives you easier access into what's going on with all of your pipelines and the health of your Airflow instance. In this
Excellent.
case, I'm going to hop right into the DAGs view here. So DAGs, again, for folks who are not familiar with Airflow, a DAG is just your data pipeline in Airflow. So these are all pipelines. In this case, I've just got one. Probably people would have a lot more than just one if they were running this in production. But in this case, we've got our MongoDB pipeline here that does querying game vectors. Looking into this, again, a little bit of a different view, but this will be somewhat familiar for folks who have used Airflow before. We've got our grid here, which shows us each DAG run. So each column here is the time that we have run this pipeline.
Okay.
And each row here is a task. So we'll look at this more holistically in just a second, but then the colors show the status of each task. So again, going back to a key part of an orchestration tool is that visibility. So I can quickly see, in my last couple of runs, everything has been going well. True to form, as when you are developing most pipelines, I had a couple of failures here initially as I was getting everything set up.
That's no problem. We like to see everything warts and all, so it's nice to see. Yes, yeah.
I'm inherently suspicious of any demo that only includes the green, right? Like that's just not what things look like in real life.
Yes. We break a lot of stuff while we're trying to piece together demos, basically.
Exactly. But if I flip over here to the graph view of this DAG, the graph is helpful for, again, just seeing what's going on in the pipeline. So each square here is a task in my DAG.
Okay.
And we've got this organized. It looks a little complex, but it's actually a fairly straightforward pipeline in terms of implementation. So what we're doing generally is collecting some data that we have created on the back end. So again, this is designed to provide a service that recommends a video game for you to play based on, information that you submit to say, this is what I want out of my game. So we're taking some data, which are descriptions of, existing games that we will use to help provide those recommendations. So a couple of tasks exist just to extract that data and get it ready.
Okay.
Then what we're doing is transforming that data. So we're going to, again, create the embeddings for it. And this is where we're using OpenAI. So this is the kind of LLM ops part of this demo. We can look at the code for this in just a second. But this task is sending that data to OpenAI and getting the embeddings back.
Okay. That makes sense. And for anybody familiar with doing any kind of vector search operations, etc., and using embedding models, that's really the necessary step to make sense of the data that you already have back in the collection.
Exactly. That's what's going to allow you to get a result from, a query that you submit that goes beyond just the search terms, right? So it's getting kind of refer to it as like the LLM vibes that it gives back for
I love
what
that,
you've
the LLM vibes. Okay, we'll run with that one. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And one thing I'll note here too is that you'll notice the little brackets on a couple of these tasks. And that's because this one is using dynamic task mapping, which is an Airflow feature. It's not new within Airflow 3. This was released in one of the Airflow 2 minor versions, but this allows us to create parallel copies of this task when we run, and for the pipeline to adapt at runtime each time it runs for some input. So it's really helpful for our parallelization, managing, in this case, like the load, since we are sending data to an API, which you can hit rate limiting issues, things like that. Doing this helps with that and just sort of spreading that out. It also helps for just viewing what's happening in the pipeline. And if you want to rerun, say this fails for a subset of our data, we don't want to rerun and send everything back to OpenAI. We can just rerun one piece of it.
Okay, understood.
Yeah. And then after that, so we get the embeddings back from OpenAI, and we're going to load them into MongoDB, which is what we're using here for the vector database. So we'll look a little bit at that in just a second. And then That's pretty much it. So the rest of this is just, again, kind of managing this pipeline. And then the final step is we submit a query to the vector database to get a result back based on input that we put in.
Okay. And do you mind if can I ask if the first portion of, that piece that sends the data to get the embeddings, if new data was added to that collection, would that trigger automatically to do that again, Kenten, in this flow, or how is that managed? Having new source data.
Great question. So you're asking about the schedule of the pipeline. So
okay, I see the schedule there. Okay, fair
yeah,
enough.
so because this is a demo, I have actually not added a schedule to this. So that's why it's blank here. So this is only going to run when I trigger it. But within Airflow, generally, you have multiple options for scheduling. So you can obviously add like a time-based schedule. So I want this to run every day at midnight. You can also set it to schedule in a variety of different ways based on when data is available. How you know when that data is available determines what feature that you use to implement that. So one potential way of doing that in Airflow 3 is using assets. So if you have another DAG or another pipeline that creates the data that is then used by this pipeline, you can connect those two via the schedule using the assets feature.
So it can trigger then. Okay.
Exactly. So it will just run when that data is available. If you need to look at, say, an external system, so that data is provided by something that is not run within Airflow, you can do that as well. One of the great new features in Airflow 3 was event-driven scheduling. And so that's where Airflow is going to watch an external system for like a message to arrive, something like that, and trigger the pipeline when that happens. For right now, the only supported system for that is SQS. So if you're waiting for like a message to arrive or that is part of your backend, that is a great option. I say for right now, because again, Airflow 3 kind of laid the groundwork for this feature, and that was the first system that was implemented. There's already a lot of work going on to implement this feature for other systems, so that if you are waiting for data to arrive somewhere else, you will have that event-driven scheduling capability probably in future Airflow versions.
That makes a ton of sense. And if it is if it's just normal scheduling, not event-driven, does it only, say in this instance, re-embed the delta, the new stuff, or does it go and do it all again, or how does that work?
That totally depends on how you've implemented the pipeline. So in this particular case, you would manage that logic kind of within these tasks where you're creating the collection. This one actually does have some logic built in for, checking whether the collection already exists. And then moving forward. So yes, doing that sort of pattern is very, very common and is pretty easy to implement here.
Perfect. That's very clear. Thank you. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, awesome. So one thing I'll point out is you can see the code for all of your pipelines here in the Airflow UI. This isn't where you would write the code, but you can see the code that's powering your pipeline. So again, everything here is written in Python. One thing I'll point out here just in our imports is we're importing this package called the Mongo provider. And from that, we're using the Mongo hook. So this is kind of one of the core parts of Airflow is what is referred to as providers. So these are Python packages that are not part of the core Airflow package, but that provide functions for interacting with other systems. So again, you will almost certainly need to use these when you're running with Airflow. And because Airflow is so popular, there are providers that exist for almost all of the at least commonly used tools within the data ecosystem. So this is just going to save you the hassle of trying to write a function yourself. And so Mongo has one. It's great. We're using the Mongo hook here, which is hooks are just the function that is going to make the connection and manage the authentication to an external system so that we can connect to Mongo again without having to write that ourselves. So Again, we're using that here in our first function here. We have this get Mongo database. This is just making our connection to Atlas where we're going to store those vectors. Again, we don't have much code here. It's very straightforward. All we're doing is passing in a connection. So in Airflow, connections are the objects where you're storing the authentication details for your external system. So
okay, makes sense.
Something like that. Once we have that, we can just create a client and then again use that in our functions within this pipeline to connect to that vector database.
It's great to see under the hood with all the code there. All right, too. I think developers always like to see what's happening, regardless how advanced the tooling you're giving them. If you give them a tab that will allow them to see what's going on, they'll go there.
Yeah, so exactly. We can, dig into the weeds here like as much as we want. I'll also note, I think we'll be sharing this, but all of this code is available in a tutorial that we have on how to implement this. So for hopefully Mongo and Airflow users out there, you can implement this yourself. It's very straightforward. You can go through every line of the code and explore it for everything we don't have time to cover today.
Yeah, and I'm going to drop some of those links into the comments now as well too on LinkedIn and YouTube. For those rewatching, just scroll down through the comments. You'll see those links embedded with everything else.
Yeah, awesome. One other thing I'll note here, just for highlighting Airflow 3 features before running this, is this version that's shown here. So this is part of DAG versioning that again, would allow us to flip between different versions and track how this DAG changes over time. In this particular case, I actually don't have another version in here.
Okay.
But if I did, if I made changes to this DAG, you would see a V2 and I could flip between them so that I have that history within the UI here.
Okay, that's great. I can see how that's a very powerful feature and why you called it out earlier. I can see how that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely helpful. Especially again, I have not run into many cases in the wild where people's pipelines stay static for a long period of time. Generally, things will always change, and having that history is super helpful. Yeah. Cool. Well, I can also just go ahead and run this. So triggering this is super easy. Again, this particular DAG is set up to take in some parameters. So this is where we would enter the text for what kind of game we want to play. So this is for the personalization aspect of this for the AI. This is what it defaults to here, but I can change this to say, I don't know, brain teaser, not a huge game player myself, so we'll see if that gives me back anything interesting.
This is when you know the demo's live, when somebody when you haven't read what's in the collection already. You're just winging it. I love it.
Exactly, just winging it. We'll see. So we just saw that run here as I flipped back to the grid view, and it's green, so everything is great. You can see kind of the status there. And then to see the output of this particular one, we're going to look at this query task. And this is another really cool thing about Airflow 3 is that it's a lot easier to access the task logs within the UI. So this is much faster, which in this case, we're looking at the output within the log, so it's helpful here. It's also especially helpful for any tasks that have failed. Obviously, the first thing that you're going to do is go check the logs for, all right, what happened? So you can now do that, in like 2 clicks instead of kind of navigating all the way through the UI. So here we are in our task logs, and it looks like it has suggested that I play Minesweeper, which is actually a game that I have played before, not in quite some time, but
it's been a long time for myself as well too, but an oldie and a goldie, I suppose. Yeah, everybody needs, if you're young enough never to have played Minesweeper, please go find it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that would be gosh, I didn't even think about that. But yes, definitely a classic that I think everybody should have some exposure to. So
yeah, I wasted far too much time in my youth playing that game. But anyway, I digress. But it found it. So great.
Yeah, it found it.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we obviously started off the demo on the homepage, and we're in the DAGs now. What's in the assets and the browse in the menu there? So Kenten, what else is there?
Yeah, definitely. So assets, I unfortunately don't have a great demo set up for this one, but I mentioned assets are a new concept within Airflow 3. And for those who have used Airflow 2 before, you might be familiar with the concept of data sets, which are, a way of implementing dependencies between your DAGs so that you can run pipelines only when the data that they require is available.
Okay.
Assets are kind of the next evolution of that. So they're again, one way to think about them is just a collection of logically related data that you define within your pipelines. You can actually write DAGs using assets instead of using tasks, which is what this DAG
Okay.
uses. So
Okay.
if we're looking at the code here, you'll notice uh, if I scroll down here, a lot of these task decorators. So we're defining tasks, and then that's a Python function. You can
Mhm.
also define an asset, which just works a little differently. Each asset gets its own DAG. It can have its own schedule. And again, it's meant to, if you want to write a pipeline more around the data that you are trying to create, as opposed to like a function that does a specific thing. It's kind of the highest level way of describing it. But when you have pipelines with assets defined, you will see them here, and it will give you a nice grid view, graph view, similar to what we see here just for this
Mhm.
pipeline. But with assets, you will probably see multiple pipelines, multiple DAGs represented there because your assets can be used to connect them.
Okay, excellent. And we touched on, I asked the question earlier about moving from Airflow 2 to 3. This demo itself with MongoDB, you had to update before the live stream. What were the key things? You said it wasn't too onerous. What were the couple of things that you had to change to make it work for 3?
Yeah, great question. It was not actually a huge update in this case. So, one
Okay.
of the big things that changed is, again, I mentioned a little bit before, this concept of task isolation.
Mm,
One of the
mm,
new pieces of that is what is referred to as the task SDK. So, under the hood of Airflow, there's a new way of kind of executing tasks using
sure.
this API server. So one of the changes for code that is required is the import has changed. So in almost every pipeline, you're going to be importing, a DAG object so that you can define your DAG. You will maybe be using tasks like this one is. You might be using assets like I just described.
Mhm,
Those are all
mhm.
going to come from a different place in the Airflow code. So this is one of the things that changed.
Okay.
Um, Again, a lot of these imports are actually set up so that the old versions are deprecated but not removed yet. So you might get a warning if you don't make that update, but your DAG won't necessarily fail. So the developers tried to make, the upgrade process as easy as possible given the breaking changes.
Mhm, mhm.
One other thing that changed, if I scroll down in the code, is here is where in my code is where I've actually instantiated this DAG. So told Airflow, hey, this is a pipeline. I want you to register it.
Okay.
Typically within your DAG definition here, you will have parameters that define how this pipeline will function. So in this particular case, I've got a couple of them defined here. So like the params is what you saw when I ran the pipeline. This is
Mhm,
saying
mhm.
this is what the DAG needs to run. Here's the default information if you don't populate anything. Um, Max consecutive failed DAG runs is actually a really cool parameter that allows you to control if your DAG starts failing, how many times will it continue to run while it's
Okay.
still failing before it just stops. So if you have something that runs hourly and it starts failing on Friday afternoon, you don't want it to run like 30 times or whatever over
Never
the
a Friday
weekend.
afternoon. Never
Ex-
happens. It never
No,
happens.
definitely never happens. So we can control things like that here. One thing to note that I've done with this pipeline, that if you look at some of our Airflow 2 tutorials or information, is that we always used to recommend people set the catch up parameter to false. And what
Okay.
catch up would do is, again, this DAG I've set up to not actually run on a schedule because it's a demo. But
Mhm,
most
mhm.
pipelines will have a schedule and a start date so that Airflow knows when should it run. Catch up is this parameter that says if you are to say, create this DAG but the start date is some date in the past. When you turn it on, does it actually run all of the runs that have occurred or should have occurred
Oh, I
between,
see. Okay.
when the start date was, and when the current date is? Oftentimes people don't actually want a DAG to catch up, especially if you're just testing or getting started, or things like that. But in Airflow 2, the default catch-up parameter was true. This confused a lot of people. It caused a lot of surprises where people would not really be paying attention to it. And they would just deploy a DAG, turn it on, and all of a sudden have 500 DAG runs started. So again, you have to pay attention to kind of what your Airflow infrastructure looks like. In Airflow 3, that parameter is now defaulted to false, which is, again, kind of the safer behavior, so that if you want it, it's great, you can turn it on, but by default, it's not going to. So if you're not paying attention, it's just not going to happen. All of that to say, you'll notice it's not here in the params because I don't need to explicitly set it to false.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Yeah. When we were chatting earlier, you brought up the Astronomer registry, and I might be misconstruing here altogether, but is there a notion that, I have a DAG that I've set up, but other people could benefit from this flow? Is there a shareable nature to, a DAG structure or flow with other people?
Generally, yes. We don't see that as frequently right now, but there is, I believe, a form on our registry where you could submit an example. Generally, that's submitting like a GitHub repo that is public. So there is a mechanism to do that. We think, generally this is a great thing to do if you have a flow and you can make your DAGs public. This can be really, really helpful for the community. And we love to see people, write blog posts or other content or things like that, sharing that information. The other thing that it helps with is, speaking of kind of the AI side of things, so Astronomer has built a LLM chatbot specifically for Airflow. It's called Ask Astro. If you just go to ask.astronomer.io, you will get to it. And it's designed for, helping people answer Airflow questions and write Airflow pipelines. Obviously, the more data that gets fed into tools like that, the better they will be and the more questions they will be able to answer. So I always encourage folks in the community to, if you can share what you've done publicly, that is great.
Okay, excellent. And I put a link up there that you gave me to the docs and to the Learn Airflow MongoDB. If somebody is going through that themselves, I suppose, what would be the takeaways you should say they should look out for or learn from going through that tutorial themselves, Kenten?
Yeah, I think one of the most challenging things that people often find working with Airflow is making the connections to the external system. So we have some details in that tutorial on how to make sure that your Atlas cluster is configured in a way that Airflow can talk to it. Again, that, how you actually do that in production might vary outside of what we have in the tutorial of, allow listing some IPs and things like that. You may not, again, work with your security teams if you're actually doing this in production, but that is something that frequently trips people up and that, we try on my team to provide some details around. So that's typically, I think, the first issue that we see people hit, or at least that I myself hit when I'm developing pipelines. I think it was absolutely the case in some of these failures here, was I had set this up. And I think in this case, I actually did not have my OpenAI key set up correctly. So that was this particular failure, and the second one in the embedding concepts task. So that's just a really common issue that people hit. And, something that, again, the tutorial addresses a little bit, but that's another thing where if you are running into issues with that, using a tool that's available like Ask Astro can help just sort of troubleshoot. I don't know if anybody's like me, I don't have a ton of experience in like networking and security and things like that. So when I get a connection related error, I'm like, I don't know like what the actual problem is here, like other than the obviously the
You and me
connection is
both. Yeah,
really
yeah, most definitely.
yeah, like what do I actually need to change? So I have found the like LLM tools to be somewhat helpful for just providing some troubleshooting guidance for things like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good call out. All right, too. So that would, yeah, if you run into any challenges or in doing so following the tutorial or just working with Airflow in particular, yeah, go and ask first and go and see. And then if not, go to the forums or support and get a human. But
Yeah.
hopefully you get your problem solved. Is there any other, I suppose, what we'd call kind of common pitfalls of somebody getting started with Airflow that you'd say, always be mindful of this or that, or what would you kind of advice would you give generally for somebody who might be new to this?
Yeah, great question. There are two kind of aspects I would think of with that. One is best practices around actually writing your DAGs. So we've looked at this one a little bit, which
Mhm.
is a big thing of Python code with a whole bunch of tasks defined in it. As you can kind of get a sense of from this demo, we're just writing our own Python functions
Mm, mm.
to connect with these systems and implement the use case we want. So it's super flexible in that, you can
Yeah,
write whatever you want here and implement it. That can also kind of, shoot you in the foot, right? If you
sure.
implement something that is going to cause like performance issues within Airflow or something like that. So that is where I, definitely recommend paying attention to best practices. And we have a ton of
Mhm.
resources at Astronomer on, to
Okay.
help you kind of narrow down like what you should pay attention to when you're getting started. We do best practice webinars all the time. We have guides for it in the same site where if you look at the tutorial here for this particular example,
Mhm,
that site
mhm.
has other best practice guidance that'll talk about, when should you use features that we've talked about today, like dynamic task mapping, or how do you manage your DAG versioning and things like that. The other aspect I'll add is that, this particular example is pretty straightforward. We've mentioned I've got, one DAG
Yeah.
running in this environment. It's not particularly resource intensive. We're offloading like most of the, heavy lifting to OpenAI and MongoDB, which is a
Mhm.
great pattern to use in general. But in production, you are probably going to be dealing with more complex use cases. You might have thousands of these pipelines that you have to
Mhm,
run.
mhm.
And so you will very quickly have to pay attention to, okay, how is Airflow actually running and what resources do I have? And how can I manage that in a way that everything is going to be reliable and scalable as we add more pipelines? That is something that, again, we have some guidance just generally to follow on
Mhm,
that.
mhm.
Airflow is built to scale, so there's a lot of knobs you can tune in terms of how you can get it to perform for whatever you need it to do. It's also something where using a managed service can help a lot because that just takes
Yeah,
away that
sure.
aspect entirely. You just don't even have to think about that. So I think we have a link to like the free trial of Astro, which also I would say goes for if you are brand new to Airflow and you're just looking to kind of play around with it, that can be a great option. Or you can use the Astro CLI, which is free for everybody. That's what I'm running here. You can see I've got this running locally on my computer. Running Airflow itself, especially setting it up for the first time, can actually be quite challenging. It's just a lot of different moving pieces to work with and figure out. And so taking away some of that so that you can just focus on like, okay, how could I write a pipeline that does this? I think is super helpful.
Okay, cool. And I put in the comments there and just up on screen that link to that free trial. Is that free forever or time banded or what way?
It's time bounded. So
Okay.
I believe the default is 14 days. And then you get $300 of credits. I'm hesitating because I think we had slightly more credits for Airflow 3
Okay.
deployments, but it will tell you when you go and create one, or than I will. But yeah, so that's meant to get you started, and then there is a option to just swipe a credit card. So after that, so if you have if you're just playing around with it and trying it for your team or something like that, that's a good option.
Perfect. So astronomer.io/LP/sign up will get you there, right? So that's great. And thank you for having that. You mentioned obviously lots of databases you can connect to, etc. Is there anything in particular that a document database, a non-relational database like MongoDB helps in Airflow over traditional SQL databases, relational databases, or I'm putting you on the spot here, Kenten. I apologize.
No, that's totally fine. I mean, I would say for a use case like we've implemented here, so this kind of AI workflow where we want to implement like vector search for, I obviously gave it some just random text for what game that I wanted. That is not necessarily directly related to what the actual descriptions are. So this is more than just text search. That sort of thing, I think you just would not implement with kind of a traditional SQL database. You need the vector database to be able to manage use cases like that. So I think I would say more about the use case that you're implementing in terms of database choice than Airflow. Airflow can connect to any of them. And it's generally as simple as, again, setting up the connection so that you can do that. Oftentimes we see people use combinations of those. So like the Airflow metadata database itself is typically Postgres. You do have other options, but that's what will run by default under the hood. So you've got, Airflow itself is using that, but I think having the vector database for any sort of AI use cases is kind of a prerequisite, right?
Yeah, and look, it shouts out to the, when we introduced MongoDB vector search back in summer of, I don't know, not last summer, the summer before, maybe. It's all blurring to me at this point in time. But in essence, the beauty for us is that your vectors are stored in the same document as your data as well. They're all in the same collection. So it removes a lot of the complexity with managing, those, as I said earlier, the question about keeping your embeddings up to date as new data gets added as well too helps an awful lot there. This has been a great demo. Is there anything I didn't ask or didn't kind of pick out from the UI there, Kenten, you'd like to draw attention to, or have we gone through all the bits and pieces you were hoping to?
The one tiny thing I will point out that is new in Airflow 3 that people are really excited about is there is dark mode in the UI. Cool. So I can switch this. I always forget. I actually am one of the very few people out there who usually prefers light mode. So that's what I always demo from. I think it's better for demos, but lots of people will prefer working in this. So this was a big thing within the new UI that obviously is very easy to swap back and forth. So I always like to
well, look, MongoDB Atlas only got dark mode a while ago itself too. Okay. So we're in the same boat. Yeah. Definitely. And I'm not in dark mode when I'm using it because I'm so used to for years being the other way around. It's it's a brain switch, to think that you can go. So when I look at somebody else's, laptop, when I'm staring over their shoulder and they're doing something, going, oh yeah, you've dark mode on, right? Yeah, that's why it looks a bit different. But white mode for me all the way a lot of the time, definitely. I know we've certainly had a lot of conversation and we've gone through an awful lot, and I'm very mindful of your time and our viewers' time as well too. Just as we close out, what do you see as, I suppose, the future of data orchestration, and where does Astronomer and Airflow fit into that?
Yeah, great question. So I think, the future of orchestration, I've talked a lot today about, the changes in the past couple of years of the shift from, kind of traditional like dashboarding sort of use cases into much more complex things with Gen AI and MLOps. And the big, I think, kind of prompting for that shift is that companies are integrating data much more into their core products. So data is a part of, the end product for in most cases. And that is only going to continue, especially as AI gets better and better. So all of that, requires a lot of orchestration capability. Say like, even way back when I was in grad school for data science, long before there was, the AI that we have today, I would say this kind of concept of like garbage in, garbage out, for, running traditional ML models, of like, it really is very dependent on the data that you have to input and whether you can manage it in a way that is efficient and scalable and gets it into the right format. So I think the demands of data orchestration are only increasing, and that's where having a tool like Airflow can be really helpful in that one, it's built for flexibility, and also a lot of the features that I've talked about today with Airflow 3 are kind of laying the groundwork. So this is by no means like the end state, in terms of things like remote execution, things like event-driven scheduling that we touched on, the ability to run tasks in languages other than Python, all of that stuff, Airflow 3 kind of brought the foundation of, and there's already work going on that will come in, future minor versions to add more functionality there. So Airflow, the project, again, it's super popular. Everybody is very invested in having it keep up with the needs of the community of users. And so I think there's a lot to look forward to there.
Excellent, excellent. And I know you gave me a link there that I just throw up, which is to the ebook, essentially. So obviously that practical guide to Apache Airflow 3 is very suitable for most. Let me get that out into the LinkedIn comments as well too. And the 3 other links that we've thrown up, obviously to the MongoDB tutorial that we've gone through, and then to the sign up to get that trial and to have a bit of a play around. The obvious shout out then also that I'm missing is to your podcast, the Data Flowcast as well. Do they find that on the Astronomer website?
It is on the Astronomer website. I believe if you just go to astronomer.io/podcasts, it should come up. You can also find us on all of the major podcasting platforms. So we're on YouTube and Spotify and Apple and all of that good stuff. The Data Flowcast is the name you can search for there. And yeah, that's a great way to keep up. We do talk there about updates in the Airflow project, but also just a great place to go for inspiration on how Airflow is being used. We're typically just talking to companies that have implemented use cases using, Airflow 3 or whatever it is, and how they've done that. So that's a great way to follow us.
Excellent. And how often do you podcast? How often are those episodes out?
They're released every week on Thursdays.
Every week on Thursdays. Okay. I better go subscribe myself to return the favor. But Kenten, this has been incredibly eye-opening. I think I did not know an awful lot about Airflow coming into this, and certainly for Astronomer as well too. So thank you very much for the very easy to follow demo and all the links that you gave us. And, I certainly agree that if you can orchestrate something, and I've been there, I've done the cron jobs, as you said, in the past, and the only time that you realize the cron job isn't working is when the cron job doesn't work. Right. That's it,
Exactly.
So, I'm a big fan of orchestration and obviously the tooling and everything else that you have in behind it. So this has been great. So we have the links, we have the site, so we have everything else. Any last few words, Kenten, for the audience, or any kind of other things for them to think about if they're trying to get started into their data orchestration journey?
Yeah, I mean, I will say again, if you're new to Airflow or new to orchestration and just getting started, Airflow, highly recommend the resources that Astronomer has, both for running Airflow yourself. The Astro CLI is the easiest way to do that locally. A trial of Astro is a great way to get started running it with a managed service. And then, my team, like I said, is heavily invested in helping people get started and making sure they have a good Airflow experience. So join our webinars or use the Academy or whatever it is. And we hope there's something there that'll help regardless of, what you're trying to do with Airflow. But I think that's it. Thanks so much for having me on. This has been really, really fun.
Not at all. It's been great. You made my job super easy, Kenten. So obviously the long history that you have in your own podcast helps when you become the guest instead of the host. So super easy to follow. I really appreciate that. And so for anybody who tuned in, thank you so much as well too. All the links are in the comments. So if you're rewatching this, scroll to the bottom of the comments. You'll get all the links that Kenten has given us. And for me, obviously the plug, if you want to go check out after that tutorial with MongoDB, go check out MongoDB and Atlas. I presume a lot of folks tuning in here are already familiar with Atlas, but we have some great resources. Also, if you go to developer.mongodb.com, you're going to end up with a lot of the tutorials and how-to articles that we have. But for me, for what I said at the beginning, world live streaming, superb episode. Kenten, I appreciate the preparation and updating the tutorial to 3 for MongoDB. I appreciate that. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Of course. Thanks again, Shane. Great to be with you here on World Streaming Day.
World Streaming Day. See, you wouldn't have known it was World Streaming Day if you hadn't joined it. No. So now everybody else knows as well too. So from me, Shane McAllister, Kenten, thank you so much indeed. I always say to guests that the reward for good work is more work. So whenever there's an Airflow 4 or some other major change, we'll certainly try and get you back on as well too. Thank you so much.
I would love to.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much, Kenten.